Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our Black History Month Town Hall with Hornets Sports and Entertainment and Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Charlotte Hornets are extremely proud to team up with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina for the third straight year as we celebrate Black History Month. Hopefully, many of you still have some great memories from last year's event when we recognized and honored the Greensboro Four. Unfortunately, we're not able to get together in person this year, but we are excited to bring this event to you virtually. The theme for this year's conversation will center around the intersection of health equity and economic mobility. And before I introduce today's moderator, let's first hear a few words from Dr. Mandy Cohen, Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, on this very important topic.
I would say health equity is an approach to make sure that all North Carolinians or anyone has the ability to have access to resources, whether those be healthcare, economic resources, education resources, in a way that allows for success across the board. And equity does not mean equal. It mean that we have to think differently about how we are thinking about what we measure, what we give our time and our resources to. I think that, the United States has certainly grappled with our history of racism in our country, and particularly this year, we have seen the pervasive injustices built into our system come out in a new way with this COVID pandemic, but they've always been there. This is nothing that is new. And I think that our inequalities and inequities in our healthcare system are a reflection of those systemic racism, that we see in a lot of those sectors. And we at the department have been measuring racial and ethnic and health disparities for many years, and we put out reports every year. But what we know is measuring is only the foundation of what we need to do. And I would say we don't measure well enough across the board, but measuring is foundational to being able to then do the things we need to do to use our time and our resources and our influence to actually change the way in which healthcare is delivered or education is delivered, and all of the services across the board, because it's not just healthcare that impacts someone's overall health. And that gets to your question about social determinants, right? So our healthcare and how we deliver healthcare is only one piece of what impacts someone's health. We know that there's so much more, and they're all interconnected. Your ability to get a good education and a job, where you live, your zip code, we know is so important to your overall ability to live a long and healthy life. And so we have to look even beyond the healthcare sector as we think about these issues.
And now I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Blue Cross and Blue Shield Senior Vice President, Chief Legal and Administrative Officer, Danielle Gray.
Thank you, Mike. And thank you to Hornets Sports and Entertainment for hosting this event. Being here is much more than a pleasure. We are here to discuss work that is of critical importance. Black History Month is the time when we all pay tribute to the contributions made by the African American community. But to truly honor this legacy, we must continue and build upon that work. Joining me today are Dr. Tunde Sotunde, President and CEO of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, and Fred Whitfield, President and Vice Chairman of Hornets Sports and Entertainment. Tunde and Fred, just to get us started, the past year has made it painfully clear that some of the most important work ahead of us is in the arena of health equity. COVID has taken its toll on all of us, but we know that communities of color were especially hard hit. For instance, Black people represent only 12% of the United States population, but 34% of the country's COVID-19 deaths. This disproportionate impact serves as a stark reminder of how health equity and economic mobility intersect. So Tunde and Fred, just to get us started, could you tell us how your organizations are addressing some of these disparities?
Thanks, Danielle. The truth of the matter is that many of us in healthcare have known for quite a while now and talked about for quite a while now about the health disparities and the racial inequities that exist in our communities and our society as a whole. However, I don't think that most of us had an understanding of how deep and systemic these inequities were in our society until we started reading and hearing reports that clearly indicated that individuals of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, people of color, and minorities were being disproportionately affected by this pandemic. Within weeks of hearing those reports, at Blue Cross, we swung into action. We convened a coalition of the willing, as I've often described it. Multiple stakeholders across the public and private sector, including our friends here at the Charlotte Hornets, to support the Department of Health and Human Services in a very robust, a very concerted public health campaign around the 3 W's. Wear your mask, wait 6 feet, wash your hands. At Blue Cross to date, we've spent close to $15 million at least in supporting community-based organizations that have been front and center of dealing with the social issues, food insecurity and so on, that have manifested even more so as a result of the pandemic in our underserved, underprivileged communities and so on. At Blue Cross, we've distributed close to 1 million hand sanitizers across the state. Unfortunately now, we're now hearing reports that suggest that people of color and minorities are being vaccinated at disproportionately lower rates compared to other racial and ethnic groups. So we're now pivoting, again, as a coalition to ensure the equitable distribution and administration of vaccines to those who, by the way, are the same individuals that need it the most because they're the most vulnerable. One other thing is that we realize that there's vaccine hesitancy in our communities. And we as business and community leaders must step up to address vaccine hesitancy. We have to lead by example. That trust is going to come from within our communities. It's not going to come from outside. The good news is that we're now seeing examples of leaders stepping up. Just a couple of weeks ago, 60 Black members of the National Academy of Medicine, including our very own Dr. John Lumpkin, penned an article basically reinforcing or reemphasizing the importance of minorities and people of color getting vaccinated and so on. So we need more examples of such leadership. Chancellor Harold Martin, who is Chancellor of North Carolina A&T University, and also his wife, just released an infomercial, and basically an infomercial of them getting the vaccine and the importance, emphasizing the importance. So that's the type of leadership, that's the type of examples that we as business and community leaders, it's going to take a coalition of the willing in order to address health disparities across our communities.
Yeah, first of all, Tunde and Danielle, thank you so much for having me join you today. It's an honor to represent our organization in celebration of Black History Month. As you probably are aware, we've had a great partnership with Blue Cross and Blue Shield over the years. And Black History Month is one that they and we have felt strongly about that we could make and have an impact in our communities across the Carolinas. And being here today is certainly an honor for me. And as I think about Black History Month, having grown up in Greensboro, having last year celebrated Black History Month with the Greensboro Four. Certainly my dad was was a student at North Carolina A&T, Tunde, and graduate, undergrad, and master's degree there. And my mom went to Bennett College, historically Black women's college in Greensboro, and got her master's degree at North Carolina A&T. So I personally have a storied history with North Carolina, with Greensboro, with some of the struggles that we've gone through. But as you talk about the great things that Blue Cross and Blue Shield has done during the pandemic, I want to personally thank you for stepping up in our mask campaign that our Charlotte Executive Leadership Council led under Gene Woods' leadership of Atrium, being one of those first to commit to help us be able to get masks that were going to be distributed in the underserved communities here in Charlotte and in our region. So thank you for that. As I reflect on the healthcare disparity, I also think there's certainly an economic mobility issue that we've been dealing with over the years in our communities. And what we have tried to do in the last year or so is to really get focused on economic mobility. And I'll just take a quick step back. It actually started in 2014 when we here in Charlotte found out that we were 50 out of 50 in the United States of large cities in economic mobility, basically saying a young person that was born into and reared in an underserved neighborhood had a very, very slim chance. So 50 out of 50 in the United States of getting out of poverty in their entire lifetime. And so we as a community started really focusing on that in 2014. In 2016, when we unfortunately had our own police related shooting in Charlotte, the Keith Lamont Scott shooting, it really, I think, elevated the visibility of economic mobility, that we as a community needed to address something together. And our community really started focusing on that, and our organization started focusing on that. Our players took the lead and created a fund to fund some underserved young people that grew up in Title I schools to be able to go to college and have their tuition and all fees paid in full. And I applaud them for that. And then, obviously, with the unfortunate George Floyd situation, that visibility and focus has really grown in our community in Charlotte. And I appreciate how we as a community have focused on it. In addition, last month, we created our social justice platform, actually announced it on MLK holiday. And it really just, again, amplified our focus on economic mobility, on racial equity, and it was an extension of our focus on voting efforts during the 2020 elections. The last thing I wanted to mention, Tunde, which is something that we feel very strongly about, which is the vaccination process. And we're well aware of the disproportionate number of minorities that have received the vaccine. We know the statistics. We work very closely with Governor Cooper and Dr. Cohen in their efforts in distributing the vaccines. We're thrilled that just last Saturday, we were able to have a mass vaccination event in the Spectrum Center in partnership with Novant Health, our healthcare partners. We actually vaccinated over 2,400 individuals. It was a very unique situation because we had to figure out how to manage that and execute in the middle of two home games, a home game on Friday night and a home game on Sunday afternoon. But it was great to see a very diverse population of our community come into our building. We feel like, and Novant felt like, our building was the absolute best venue in Uptown Charlotte because of its location, right on the light rail, right across from the public transportation station, plenty of parking around, and with our partner and ally bank, who agreed to pay for parking for those that came in, we were able to easily be able to have so many of our community members that ordinarily wouldn't be able to get out or may not have transportation or may not be able to have access to get to a vaccination site, be able to come right here for that event. We're excited about March 6th, which will be the booster shot day for those that received their vaccinations last Saturday. We're excited for those smiling faces and those who know that they were impacted in a positive way in a life-changing experience of getting that vaccine and feeling really good about it. really excited that we were able to participate in that way. And so we're committed, like you and your teammates at Blue Cross and Blue Shield are, to doing everything we can to create a safe environment and ambiance that people will feel comfortable in coming in and getting vaccinated. And so with that, we're looking forward to partnering again in the future once we get the second half of our game schedule and identifying dates that we can partner with Novant Health to do additional mass vaccination dates.
Yeah, that's great, Fred. You know, as I often say, it takes a coalition of the willing. I want to underscore the comments you made around economic mobility and health equity. I came across a very shocking statistic a couple of weeks ago that right here in the Research Triangle, you know, we're headquartered in the Research Triangle in Durham. And many of us, we have a 5,100 person workforce. So many of us live around the Research Triangle. And the statistic was this, that a 5 mile distance, 5 miles, and I go jogging on the weekends, and that's about on average what I cover when I go jogging. 5 miles can make the difference as to whether one lives to be 80 years of age. So your lifespan, 88 years versus 77 years of age.
Wow.
An 11-year difference in how long one may live, just depending on a 5 mile radius here in the Research Triangle. It is mind-boggling. So you're absolutely right. Health equity, economic mobility go hand in hand. In fact, again, the data has been clear that the primary drivers of health equity or health inequity, frankly speaking, are social, environmental, and economic issues or factors that exist across our communities. So it goes hand in hand. There's no question about it. One of the things that we did last year was we actually raised the minimum wage for our frontline workers to $16 an hour. We did it quietly without any fanfare. One of the reasons why we did it is because, like many other organizations, and this is the truth of the matter, most of the frontline workers tend to be disproportionately minorities, people of color, individuals of ethnic and racial diverse backgrounds. That's the truth, compared to the higher levels of the organizations. So we were like, this is, to your point, economic empowerment. We have to drive economic mobility. And this is one of the ways we can do it. The other thing we're looking at right now is recalibrating and reassessing our diversity vendor supplier spend with a specific focus on minorities, women, and veteran-owned businesses. Because if we can increase more of our spend for those suppliers and vendors who tend to be small businesses in our local communities, that then creates jobs, which then helps to drive up or elevate economic mobility. So I think, you know, you're right on. And that's where I think all of us as business and community leaders need to wrap our heads around it and rally around each other and support one another in that regard. So,
you know, I think you guys are dead on. You're on to some very interesting things. The diversity supplier chain is something that the NBA has been heavily focused on, and we as an organization have been focused on. When we hosted the 2019 NBA All-Star Game, we used our unique city of Charlotte to really be a leader in the diversity supplier chain and really trying to help make sure that diverse businesses, women-owned and minority businesses, got a chance to really profit from the All-Star Game coming here. I mentioned Charlotte being a unique city. It's not many cities in the South where you've got an African-American female mayor, and we've got one of the best mayors in the country in Vi Lyles. And we've got an African-American city manager, African-American police chief, African-American chairperson or chairman of our county commissioners, and a community that embraces diversity and inclusion of all type. And we're proud of it. And it's part of what makes Charlotte so special, that it's part of the core of who we are. And so again, I applaud all the great things that you all are doing at Blue Cross and Blue Shield to really address these disparities that have been systemic over many years, that, as we all are aware of, and trying to make sure that the future doesn't look like the past.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fred.
Sure.
Fred, can I just commend you for the mass vaccination event that you all just did? It's funny, we were having a conversation that Tunde led last week about some of the trade-offs between the speed at which we can get shots in arms and get people vaccinated and equity issues. And it sounds like you all successfully did it, pulled off an event that did both, got shots in a lot of arms and also addressed some of these healthcare disparities. And so we certainly commend you for that.
Well,
I thought I would switch topics slightly and touch on Tunde and Fred, you both have talked a lot about activities that our organizations are undertaking, but for our colleagues who are watching at home from both of our organizations and folks who will see this show on social channels, one of the things with George Floyd is it really challenged us all to ask, how can I help? How can I as an individual address these issues in my household, at my workplace, in my community, at my community organizations, whether it's my church or a nonprofit organization. So I was hoping, and maybe Tunde, you could get us started. You could address what folks at home can do to push the needle on some of these DEI issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it starts off with us all acknowledging that there's a problem. There's a problem, a major problem with racial inequities, social injustice, that not just in healthcare, but affects pretty much every aspect of our lives in today's society. If you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, how can you solve for it? So to your earlier points, we must have raw, real, and meaningful conversations, whether it's at home with our families, with our friends, with our neighbors, our social circles, our communities, or even at the workplace, whether it is through social media channels, blogs, articles, editorials. We must talk about and confront these issues, understand how we got to this place, listen to one another, our various experiences, and then now talk about actions we can take collectively to heal and move forward. I would contend that the reason why we're here today, and Fred alluded to this, is not just decades, but centuries of structural, institutional, and systemic racism, discrimination, and bias that has led to an underrepresentation, for example, of minorities and people of color in the medical profession, sciences, legal professions, in financial services, information technology, and so on. Lack of equal opportunity for jobs, lack of opportunities for job advancement, lack of basic services, not even to talk about healthcare in our communities, our underserved, our underprivileged communities. So we must, all of us, we have an obligation to speak up and not to accept when we observe or actually even experience, as many of us have, these social injustices. So I'll give you an example. Last year, Fred, after the unfortunate killing of George Floyd, and by the way, many others before him, at Blue Cross, we were like, we got to say something about this. We got to publicly. We have to. To my knowledge, I think that's the first time in our history that we ever made any public statement about state of race relations. And we felt compelled to, because we had to take a position that clearly signaled our zero tolerance for racism, discrimination, and bias. So what did we say? We said, no community can be truly healthy. No community can be truly healthy until racism, discrimination, and bias no longer exists. We then very quickly created inclusion circles so that individuals at all levels of our organization had safe environments to have these conversations, again, so we can understand, listen to each other, and then figure out how to move forward. We required all our people managers to go through a 3-part racial equity training. We also reaffirmed our commitment. And we've actually made a lot of progress in this regard, but we felt it was important to reaffirm the commitment that our workforce would be truly reflective at all levels of the organization of the diversity of the communities in which we all live and work. So those are just some examples of ways in which we can address and confront these issues that then permeate into our communities and creates that groundswell that can then drive the much needed change. Fred said this, we have an obligation to leave this place a better place for the generations to come, for our children and children's children. And we have to own it.
Tunde, you make some phenomenal points. And again, I really appreciate and applaud your intentional efforts at Blue Cross and Blue Shield to proudly address these issues. I'd say it's really important for organizations, large and small, to do the same. I think we're a little unique as a company, and certainly unique in the NBA. I'll start with the NBA. I really respect and applaud the way our commissioner, Adam Silver, has been very, very intentional about addressing any form of racism or discrimination of any type from the day he took the job. I think most of you probably remember a month or so into the job, he had to make a really difficult situation with the former owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, and was swift and decisive in that decision to have ownership be relinquished and sold to Steve Ballmer now, but also the swiftness and decisiveness that he made relative to House Bill 2. And we as a league and we as an organization supported that. But also after the George Floyd killing, our league being intentional and on the front end, not only at the league level, but through our players, speaking loudly and having a voice on things needing to change. And I think you saw in the bubble that we created as a league in Orlando, the Black Lives Matter messaging, the messages on the back of the jerseys, the unity that the players showed on the court during the national anthem, and being able to express themselves in any way they felt appropriate, was something that our league feels strongly about and supports. And then I mentioned the uniqueness of our organization. Having Michael Jordan as the only majority owner of a professional sports franchise in the 4 major league of sports is something that's very unique. I feel very fortunate to be one of 2 African Americans to lead the business operations of the 30 teams in our NBA, sharing that honor with the CEO, Cynthia Marshall of the Dallas Mavericks, who's the former president of North Carolina AT&T, and a friend of our state and our community. But the uniqueness of the way our organization is built up organically, and being very, very diverse from the time I arrived here 16 years ago in my role as president and chief operating officer, being hired at the time by Bob Johnson, who started BET Television, Black Entertainment Television, was actually who hired me and partnered with Michael initially to bring the Charlotte Bobcats into the NBA. And so from that time forward, because of the uniqueness of our ownership group, We've been very intentional from day one about being diverse and inclusive. It's been easy for us to have really difficult conversations that maybe others couldn't have because we personally have experienced a lot of the things, Tunde, that you mentioned, and felt like it was worthy of sharing some of those experiences with our teammates. But one of the things that we've been focused on throughout our organization is, to your point, Tunde, every level of our organization, starting with our internship program, has to be diverse because typically those interns that we bring in during the summer or during the semester end up being an entry-level teammate and becoming a part of our full-time staff at the Hornets. And so I'm proud that we have 35 former interns that are now full-time employees and part of our organization. Had we not had a diverse internship program, we certainly wouldn't have a diverse entry-level group of young people that can grow within our organization. And then as we go out and try to add teammates at any level, to your point, Tunde, we make sure we have a wide, diverse pool of candidates for every role and try not to just look at diversity and inclusion, but look at it intentionally, but also try to hire the brightest and the best and hope that organically we can have that really best practice organization with the brightest and the best that happen to be diverse that we're proud of. And so our involvement with the Global Diversity and Inclusion Council at the NBA from its inception 6 years ago with Ora Stewart, who was a former just the Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Chief Officer at the NBA, now Chief Human Officer at the NBA and Diversity and Inclusion, has led our efforts to look at our league, all of our leagues, the WNBA, the NBA, the 2K League, the NBA Developmental League, our G League, to make sure that it's diverse in every way. Women coaches, women executives, African American and people of color in positions throughout all these organizations, so that as we get down the road, there are many more minorities in senior leadership roles on both the basketball and the business side of every team and at the NBA. And having a leader like Adam Silver and his senior executive team that's not only committed to it, but does what it says. When you look at Adam's senior council of leaders, you've got a deputy commissioner in Mark Tatum, who's African American. I mean, I could just go down the list of his senior leadership team and just how diverse it is in every way. And I think that's the only way that we're able to address this. And, last but not least, I'd like to talk a little bit about Michael Jordan's efforts, not just in our community, and I say our community, I mean the Carolinas. I'm sure you probably heard that he partnered with Novant Health, donated $7 million to open 2 clinics in Charlotte in underserved neighborhoods to provide quality health care. Well, just this week, he announced another $10 million commitment to partner with Novant and do the exact same thing in his hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina. He also, through his partnership with Jordan Brand, has committed $100 million over the next 10 years to address systemic racism and social inequities. And the Jordan Brand and Michael are heavily committed as partners to make sure they address that across the country. And then at the NBA level, we just announced that the NBA Foundation has been established, and it's a commitment of all 30 NBA owners to donate $1 million per year per team, so $30 million a year over the next 10 years, $300 million that'll be donated across the country. Many of those dollars going into our NBA team cities in the underserved communities to be able to fight systemic racism and economic mobility, support programs that are doing great things in these areas and are having results, and really be able to give them the needed capital to be able to grow and continue their efforts. And so to your point, Tunde, it's going to be an all hands-on effort by all of us. I'm proud of what our league is doing. I'm extremely proud of our owner and what he and his family are doing personally. And it thrills me to hear what you all at Blue Cross and Blue Shield are doing and committed to, because it's going to take the large companies, the small companies, it's going to take all of us to really be true to ourselves. And if we really believe it, we have to put our money where our mouth is, and also put the sweat equity in to getting out into our communities and fighting that battle. And last but not least, Betsy Mack, who oversees our community efforts in Charlotte and is executive director of our foundation, has just done a phenomenal job with her team in really being able to identify these type areas in our community in Charlotte and establish these great pillars that touch all the things that we've been talking about today to try and help those in need and be a positive force and really earn our way in the community by giving back in a very thoughtful and strategic way.
Thank you so much, Fred.
Sure.
I want to go back to something Fred said earlier. Fred noted that we are fortunate enough to have an incredibly strong leader, African-American woman, as mayor of the city of Charlotte. And recently, she declared racism a public health issue. And we'd like to now play a short video from Mayor Lyles addressing this topic.
As mayor of this community, this great city that we live in, the 5th fastest growing and the 15th largest city in this country, when I think about how do we deal with the issue of racial equity, the first thing I want to do is acknowledge it. And I've gone to the private sector, our corporate community, our business community, to ask them to understand a few key points about how they work. Do they pay people enough to live in our city, especially Black and brown people? Do they allow pathways for Black and brown people to be successful in their businesses, knowing the fact that their success is not because they're not talented, it's because perhaps they weren't given the ability to show that talent just because of the way the world works. And we all understand what that means. But I think the more important ones are to be able to say, how do we rectify this? How do you ensure that people that are Black and brown can get to executive level positions? How do we make sure that our HBCU students are going to be able to get a job, an internship, and be part of the workforce talent that's being developed? And then finally, I think the last thing that I would say is, how do we make sure that the digital divide between Black and brown and white communities will not continue to hinder us during COVID, and even further will make it possible for Black and brown kids to catch up after COVID. You know, it means that when we have to acknowledge the idea of race and racism and systemic racism, it actually speaks first to people that have experienced this. It speaks to our people that are Black and brown, that we understand and we are trying to deal with something that's going to make a difference. So the first thing that I think we should say is it speaks to people that we know and have to have and care about in our community. But more importantly, it speaks to the white community as well, because I think that you can't ignore what's going on any further in our community. You can't ignore the impact of systemic racism in healthcare with COVID. You can't ignore systemic racism in economic development when you cannot see and the ability to go to the bank and get a loan. You can't ignore it in education where our children are not being educated. So what I hope the real outcome and the real meaning of systemic racism and the impact of this kind of effort by Charlotte is to say to people in the white community that this is happening, and what is your accountability for it? How do you help us deal with racial equity?
So Tunde and Fred, I want to pick up on some of our conversations earlier, but actually make this a little more personal in this next segment. I have had experience myself as a Black female executive, witnessing some of the challenges that people of color have executing on their leadership vision. I'm staring at two incredible Black male leaders of your respective organizations. And just on a personal level, I think it would just be good for you to share some of your experiences navigating these issues and trying to push forward your leadership vision. And also any advice you would have for others in this regard.
Okay, Danielle, I'll start if that's okay with you, Tunde.
Absolutely.
I'm anxious to get into this in that you're saying is personal because it gets very deep for me. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. had no idea as a young person growing up that I was growing up right in the midst of history. As I think most of you know, Greensboro was right in the middle of the civil rights movement. My parents, as I mentioned, went to HBCUs in Greensboro. They marched as a part of the civil rights movement. My mom often reminds me that the only reason that she was not arrested at one point during one of the marches was because she had me in a stroller and had me rolling down Elm Street in Greensboro. But also just growing up in desegregation of schools. I was an 8th grader when busing started and schools started to be desegregated in my hometown. To see the fights that were actually happening for no reason other than people were of different color, to see the racism that was rapid in our communities, thinking about my high school prom and us not being able to host that prom at Forest Oaks Country Club, which was 2 miles from my high school because they didn't allow Blacks in the club at the time, is something that I reflect on. Just a couple personal instances I'd like to share that have really impacted my life as I look back on the Greensboro Four and the history of Greensboro, the sit-ins and so forth. November 3rd, 1979 is the date that I'd love for people to Google and just put Greensboro, North Carolina, November 3rd, 1979. That is probably one of the saddest days ever in the history of Greensboro. That was the day of the Death to the Klan March that was being held by a group in Greensboro, the Communist Workers Party, and it was a peaceful march in Morningside Homes, which was one of the housing projects in Greensboro. Unknowingly, once that march started, they were attacked by a group of Klansmen that jumped out of the back of a van and actually shot and killed 5 members of that march that day. It gets sadder because as those that were accused went to trial, they were represented pro bono, Tunde, free, by attorneys in the Greensboro community. They all were acquitted by an all-white jury. And when I started practicing law in Greensboro, little did I know that a lot of the guys that I was drinking coffee with before calendar call each morning were a part of the group that represented them and had them acquitted. So that was a real eye-opener for me of what my hometown was about. I played college basketball at Campbell University, a small Southern Baptist Division I school in North Carolina in Bowie's Creek, not far from the Triangle area. And after graduating with my degree in economics, I went back to Campbell as an assistant coach and also as a professor of a couple classes, and certainly felt like everyone on campus knew who I was, thinking I was this hotshot former player that was now in grad school and coaching. And ironically, when I went to pick up my first paycheck at the bursar's office, the young lady there told me, "I'm sorry, you're at the wrong place to pick up your check. Your check's over at maintenance because you're on the staff. There's no way you're on the faculty, you're on the staff," which basically meant I was cutting the grass and painting dorms. And so again, eye-opener to me, place I played college basketball, place I earned my MBA, that's what I went through. And then last but not least, and this is probably the most interesting, in that I now work in the NBA, 1990 NBA All-Star game in Miami. I finished law school in 1988, was a young practicing attorney, had a great relationship and friendship with Michael Jordan. And at that time, he invited me down to enjoy All-Star weekend and the festivities with him. The Bulls were playing the Miami Heat on that Monday after All-Star weekend. So I planned a long weekend in Miami with Michael and our other friends. So I flew down from RTP, Tunde, from the airport in Raleigh-Durham, RDU, landed in Miami. As I flew back that Tuesday after the All-Star game and the Heat-Bulls game, I get off my plane in Raleigh-Durham. And as soon as I get off, I see a young lady looking at me. She waves at me, smiles, standing over in the corner. Don't think anything about it. I wave back. I walk on to baggage claim. I get halfway to baggage claim. I see that she's still in the same vicinity with me. Still don't think anything about it. I get the baggage claim and I see her standing off to the side. She waves again, smiles, and she has a couple of gentlemen with her. Again, still don't think anything at all about it. But as the bag started to come around the carousel, the minute I touched my bag, I was surrounded by the police. And they surrounded me. They told me they wanted me to come in the back room. They needed to talk to me about what I was doing on this trip, that they've been tracking me from Miami. And when I stopped in Atlanta to switch flights, connect on my flight to Raleigh-Durham, they've been watching me the whole way, and they suspected I was a drug courier. Of course, on this Tuesday afternoon, I had a Jordan brand sweatsuit on and brand new Jordan brand sneakers that Nike had sent me. I certainly looked like I was having a great time because I was coming out of a great time at All-Star Weekend. And back then, I was such a young lawyer, I kept my bar license in my back pocket next to my driver's license. And I was so proud because it was so hard to earn that I wanted to keep that with me everywhere I went. And so they asked for my boarding pass and they asked for my ID and they wanted me to go back in the back room. So I said to the officers that day, here's my boarding pass. I went into my wallet, I got my license, and I got my bar license. I said, I'm an attorney. And either you're going to arrest me or you're going to let me go and you're going to tell me why you're detaining me. Otherwise, we got a problem. Well, needless to say, they sprinted away in different directions and left me alone. But I'll never forget that because it was all about the color of my skin. It was the way I was dressed. They profiled me. And that happens so often unfairly to those of color. And something that we need to share these kind of experiences with our colleagues, our young colleagues especially, because as I've shared it within our company, I think our young colleagues are just shocked that this actually has happened to somebody that they know. And I just happen to be at 62 years old enough to experience a lot of the systemic racism that has happened over time. And my hope is that sharing these real life experiences will certainly open some eyes to those that feel like everyone should be treated equally and the same.
Thank you, Fred. Tunde?
Yeah, where do I start? It's been quite a journey, needless to say. Fred, I didn't grow up in the United States. I spent my early childhood in Lagos, Nigeria, which is where I was born, and my parents are from. And then I spent my teenage years in boarding school in the United Kingdom. And by the way, this was in the early 80s, and I was one of two people of color in the entire school.
Wow.
And I never once felt or never once thought twice about the color of my skin until I immigrated to the United States 30 years ago. Up to that point, yeah, I knew, there were white people, there were black people, and there was every shade in between. And that was it. But it was when I finally set foot on the soil here in the US, I became acutely aware that the color of my skin was a problem, not could be, was a problem. And that's why I say it's been quite a journey. So I for sake of full disclosure, I did not have the experiences you had growing up, and I can't even imagine. But, in the last 30 years, I have, had many of the same experiences that you just described. So I've had to contend with not only the challenges of being a minority person of color, also an immigrant. And by the way, I have a name that many people cannot even pronounce at the first blush, but here I am, here we are today. So have I experienced conscious, unconscious, subtle, maybe not so subtle, racism, discrimination, and bias? Absolutely. But just like you alluded to, it's all about being resilient, persevering, not allowing anybody to judge you based on the color of your skin, but instead based on the content of your character, and just staying the course. I was lucky early enough in my career after I did my residency training here in the US, which is why I immigrated here in the first place. And then very early in my career, I realized that, and I'll be honest, accept it, because I think it's hard to say this, but acceptance is important. I accepted the fact that to move up, to get anywhere, especially in corporate America, I had to go the extra mile. I had to take on assignments that nobody else wanted, that I had to work harder and work smarter than anybody else around me, that I had to drive results that nobody could dispute because the facts speak for itself. So you can't say, oh, it's by chance, you know. That's just what I realized and accepted that I had to do. Give you an example. Many, many, many years ago, my first opportunity to run revenue generating business unit at a company. So I'm responsible for profit and loss, right? So nobody wanted to touch this business unit. It was a turnaround. It was in bad shape, bad shape. But I was like, unfortunately, might be my only window. So I went to the CEO and I raised my hand. Of course, he knew he had nothing to lose if it was in bad shape. And nobody else wanted it anyway. 3 years, we turned it around. Assembled a team. It wasn't just me. Assembled the team. We turned it around. Not only that, we were consistently year over year the best performing business unit in that company. So fast forward a couple of years later, you know how you have these leadership events. I call them kumbayas. You get together somewhere. So, you know, we have one of those events. There are award ceremonies. The business unit I was running, you know, won quite a few awards. The then CEO, I shall remain unnamed, pulls me aside and says, Tunde, whispers in my ear, I was extremely skeptical that somebody like you could make this happen.
Wow.
And I was like, somebody like me, I was the first African American, you know, leader or head of any revenue generating business unit in that company. I'm the only one at that time. But I didn't let it faze me. I was like, okay, I hear you, but I have my eye on the ball. You're not gonna be the master of my own destiny, because I know where I want to go and where I need to go. So what I would say to those coming behind us, the next generation, you have to be resilient. You have to persevere. You have to be emotionally strong. I would like to see more of minorities and people of color go into professions, medicine, sciences, legal profession, financial services,
Sports.
information, sports. Yeah, because that's where, you know, that's you talk about economic mobility, right? That's where a lot of the action is, and the decisions are being made, unfortunately, right? So that's one. But to do that, we also have to accept the fact that we must double down on our investments and support of our historical Black colleges and universities. Because unfortunately, whether we like it or not, the truth of the matter is still today, that is probably one of the only avenues for many to get that training, education, exposure, right? Across the aisle. So we must continue, we must double down, not even must double down. We must also, and Fred, you said this, we have to commit as business and community leaders that our workforce will be reflective of the diversity of our community at all levels of the organization. We have to, because if we don't do it, who's going to do it? And then we have to make sure that we continue to make those investments in our community to drive economic mobility, you know, access to basic services that don't exist in many of our communities today. And the other thing that I would say is that I'd also like to see more emphasis at the college and university level around diversity, equity, and inclusion included in the curriculum and cultural sensitivity, because you need to start early, so people are conscious and aware of all these dynamics across the board, so that by the time they get into their careers and professions and whatever, hopefully they were not going to have to deal with what you and I, Fred, and others, many others, have had to deal with. It should be much easier for them. That, to me, is one of the greatest legacies that I think we, as people of color and minorities, can leave for those behind us.
Hey, Danielle, can I just chime in again?
Please do, Fred.
But I talked about the negatives of growing up in Greensboro and some of the experiences I had, but let me just touch on two very positives that really impacted my life in a big way. Because Greensboro had two other phenomenal leaders, a number of other phenomenal leaders in the community that helped shape a lot of our lives that grew up in Greensboro. I just want to mention Elrita Alexander Ralston, who was an African-American female who graduated from Dudley High School, which was a Black high school in Greensboro at the age of 15, went to North Carolina A&T and graduated at the age of 18, and then could not get into a law school in North Carolina because of her race. And so instead, she went to Columbia School of Law and graduated from there as the first Black female graduate in 1945. And then she came back to North Carolina and built a very successful law practice in Greensboro. And then went on to become the first Black female in the United States to be elected as a judge, and was elected in 1968 in Greensboro. And then Henry Fry Sr., you may know his name. He and I attended the same church, and he and my dad were best friends. They attended North Carolina A&T together. And he was a lot of firsts. He was the first Black assistant U.S. attorney, the first Black member of the North Carolina General Assembly, the first Black justice to sit on the North Carolina Supreme Court, and the first Black Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And he took part in our Greensboro 4 celebration last year. And, for me and other young African-American kids to grow up in a city like Greensboro that had so much history, but have these role models that really made us believe that we could do these things that we might aspire to do, to become attorneys. And those two certainly inspired me to want to pursue a law degree and become a lawyer. And there were many others, doctors, and we all happened to, be at fortunately, the same church, a lot of us at Providence Baptist Church growing up. It's something that I will forever be indebted to my parents for providing that opportunity for me to see real role models that I could look at them, touch them, and think I could do it one day. And Tunde, you certainly have done that for, I'm sure, a lot of young people, not only here in the States, but back in Nigeria, that look at your success and can dream those dreams and know that they can potentially be real. And what I'd suggest to our young leaders that follow us, Tunde, is that they take the time to reach back and help that next group of young people and help them dream and give them that push, because anybody that thinks they did it on their own is gravely mistaken. I had so many people that helped me along the way. I'm sure you did as well, Danielle. I'm sure you had those that believed in you and pushed you and supported you. And that's how, in my opinion, the whole circle works to continue to improve the opportunities for young people, all young people. And so I applaud you, Tunde, from coming from your background, experiencing the things you experienced. I'm sure that your CEO was betting against you, that you wouldn't be able to turn that organization around, but you did. And in doing so, and being wise enough to know that it takes the right team of people around you to support you and help you be successful, is certainly one of the things that I've tried to do. And I'm very fortunate to have that kind of team to work with day in and day out, with James Jordan running the Charlotte Hornets organization.
Fred and Tunde, throughout your remarks, you've both referenced the HBCU community in North Carolina and the importance of partnerships with that community. And in North Carolina, we're really lucky that we have 10 HBCUs. They really are crown jewels in terms of assets in our state. Before we conclude, let's take a brief look at some of the work that Blue Cross North Carolina has done with our state's HBCUs.
North Carolina is home to 10 historically Black colleges and universities known as HBCUs. These institutions were established to serve the educational needs of African Americans, and today, HBCUs continue to provide a place of belonging for Black students and also serve as economic engines in our communities. Because Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina understands the impact HBCUs have, we made investments to North Carolina A&T, Winston-Salem State, North Carolina Central, and Fayetteville State to improve the diversity in the healthcare field by providing scholarships to nursing students. We also supported Johnson C. Smith Sustainability Village, which was developed to improve food security in Charlotte. Last year, investments were made to positively impact retention and graduation rates at Livingstone College, Shaw, Elizabeth City State, and St. Augustine's. A priority for our early career programs has also been creating and deepening relationships with these schools. Not only are we actively engaging HBCU students for our employment opportunities, but we are also contributing towards their professional development and career readiness. One way we are actively engaging students is through our upcoming Connecting Conversations. These are platforms for meaningful conversations between HBCU students and Blue Cross North Carolina and Hornets employees to inform students about potential opportunities within both the healthcare and sports industries. Stay tuned to learn more information about these events. As we stand with our fellow North Carolinians committed to fighting inequities facing the Black community, we know HBCUs are a large part of the solution, and we continue our commitment to stand with them.
So first, I just want to thank Tunde and Fred for such a terrific conversation. I could really listen to you both for hours, and we really appreciate you sharing some of your time and experiences and your work today with us. Once again, we want to thank everyone at the Hornets Sports and Entertainment for partnering with Blue Cross North Carolina on this forum today and on so many other things, and providing a forum for this town hall. Blue Cross North Carolina and the Hornets are North Carolina institutions. Both of our organizations are a part of and deeply committed to this state, and we are proud of that. Going forward, I hope we continue our collaboration to promote health equity and economic mobility, because together we are uniquely positioned to have a significant impact and bring about real change. Thank you so much.